Welcome back for my continued trek through the first volume of Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation. For those that are joining just into this particular part, I am basically coming from a perspective of somebody that has watched the anime for the first season and have been diving into the first volume. So kind of going through some differences between the two of them, things that really stood out to me and all that kind of stuff. So if you have not watched the anime and you're only reading the novel, I don't really spoil really anything. It's just I want to put that warning there if I do kind of insinuate something. So with that said, let's jump into chapter 7. Now, hopefully I can go faster through these chapters than I have been before. I've had my first part put up, not performing as well as I would hope for, but I do understand that most of my audience is anime viewers, so I'm kind of tapping into the market of novel and manga readers, so it's a whole new community, but it's something that I actually really enjoy, so I do want to keep pushing it as a passion project. So again, let's get into chapter 7. Starting things out, we have obviously Rudy being a lot more comfortable leaving his home. He wants to get a layout of the village itself, so he's going out more. The interesting thing is that in the novel, it gets a little more detail into the surrounding forest. We kind of knew that Paul was there as a sort of knight to protect the people, but this gets more into how the mana itself, the magic in the forest itself is building up, and that attracts and manipulates and changes the creatures of the forest itself, changing animals into monsters. And so yeah, regularly they go out there and they slay them, but they also have these things known as the hunts, where knights and hunters and local militia will actually gather and go in there and disperse any monsters that are in there. It's almost like a culling every now and then, because the animals will eventually turn into monsters. They go in there regularly to kind of thin them out so that they don't build up to something that's more difficult to deal with. Probably getting more into the aspect of monsters and how they can turn into fiends if they are given enough time. But it keeps hitting heavily, and I like this idea that Rudy himself is not dumb. He's like, I'm not going to go out there and be a hero and just go out there and try to take on monsters. No, he's like, I'm going to stay clear of that. I'm not looking to die again. He says if he did run into one, he'd probably just run back and tell Paul and just leave it at that. And this is where we finally get to meet Sylphie. Yes, Sylphie finally makes her appearance in the novel series, which is fantastic. And I can start getting into some crazy theories that I've had now that I've read this. But yeah, the encounter is the same. He's protecting her from some bullies. Interesting thing is they actually get into the fact that she was on her way to go meet her father, Laws, which again, I don't think we ever mentioned the name of her father. If I remember correctly, I think in the anime specifically, he saves her and then they hang out for a little bit and then he just takes him home and he sees the two parents from a distance at their home. But no, here she's on her way to go meet her father, take him his lunch, and so Rudy gets to actually meet his father, which is Laws. And the interesting thing is that they get into how different Sylphie is from her family. I think in the anime, they kind of mention the fact that they sort of don't seem like they match. But here they're specifically going into, yes, the hair color's different. Her hair's being green. Yes, that being kind of significant to the Superbs, but she doesn't have the diamond. But additionally, her ears are longer than her father's, which is very interesting to kind of point out. Yes, you have a mother that's human. You have a father that is half-elf. And now you have this daughter who has different color hair and longer ears. It kind of insinuates that, at least from Rudy's perspective, he's like, I'm not going to push on it, but yeah, you can kind of assume that maybe the mother had an affair. Or, additionally, like, I'm starting to push that I don't think Sylphie's even their child. I think Sylphie's probably going to be, later on, some sort of special thing. And my crazy theory is going back to the whole idea that they were pushing so heavily on the childhood friend aspect in the first chapter, maybe she's an isekai of his childhood friend. I don't think it's going to be that convenient, like a childhood friend here is a childhood friend here, but it's just one of those crazy theories I've thrown out. And if you know from the novel, please don't say anything. I know some people were pointing out in my first part that, yeah, technically they might have been emphasizing on the childhood friend just to kind of show something that he pushed away that he regrets and that's something he's going to feel here in this world. Don't push Sylphie away. You'll regret it. But it was interesting because even with Laws, Rudy's mannerisms really throws him off. And when he gets there with them and he gets to meet Laws and they talk about what happened and he's going out of his way to say, okay, well, sir, we're going to go over to this mountain over here that has this tree on it. So at the end of the day, if you don't see us come home, please look in that direction to see if we're coming and you can send help to there. And it's like, Laws is like thrown off like, what is this kid talking like this for? Like it completely throws him off how like overly detailed he is about the situation, how he's trying to be super safe with his daughter. Well, at the time he doesn't know it was his daughter, he knew it was his son, but beside the point. And following this, of course, we had the whole situation where Paul is angry at Rudy. This lady came by that mentioned that her son was attacked by Rudy, and so Paul blew up on him, wouldn't let him explain, told him to stop making excuses. But interestingly enough, we got, yes, in the anime, it kind of transitions to, yes, Rudy backfires at him, and then he talks for a brief moment with Zenith about his experience with his father and everything. But this gives us a whole inner dialogue about Paul's perspective in the whole situation. He talks about his situation with his father and everything. He had a strict family. He outburst to his father, walked out, went off and did his own thing. But the thing is that he's pointing out is that his father eventually fell ill, and he heard that his father regretted their fight in the end. He doesn't want to have that same thing happen with his son. He's like, I could have probably told my son to get out and he would have done it. Rudy looked at him like he was an insect, like he was lesser than him, and it really did bother him. But the problem that Paul is facing is that he does want to reprimand Rudy in some way because he's afraid that his son could have done something worse. This is a saint-level magic user here, and he could have done much worse. He could have been showing off. Somebody mocks him and just blasts them. But yes, in the end of this whole inner conflict that Paul is having about how do I reprimand my son? It doesn't make any sense. But he also acknowledges that I didn't let him talk. At the same time, he acknowledges that this child that he has, it doesn't even seem like his own child. He doesn't even know of anybody that he could have been their child of. He's just a whole different entity. But it's interesting that he is chopping it up as, look, I had this argument with my father. He was strict. I ran out. And now I'm doing the same to my son. And he has my blood too. He just kind of chops it up as being their bloodline, because I don't think he even has any other way of explaining it. Following this, we get a little more into the progression of Rudy and a little bit more insight into certain things that I thought was super fascinating. Interestingly enough, I think they kind of mentioned a little bit, but Rudy at this point really does want to defeat Paul. He feels like if I don't beat him now, if I don't figure out some strategy, some way of manipulating the ground or throwing him off, and I don't beat him now, later on when I come back and try to defeat him later, he'll be out of his prime and he'll have these excuses to give. So he really at this point desperately wants to defeat Paul. But additionally, on the side, of course, he's meeting up with Sylphie and he's training her how to use magic. And this is where I found very interesting because I don't recall this ever being mentioned in the anime. They talk about specifically affinity schools and opposition schools. And this is the idea that if you are in a certain environment growing up, you have a certain affinity to certain things, and again, something that is more opposed to you. So it mentions this idea that Sylphie's not good with fire magic. And he asks her, did you have any problem with fire? She's like, no, I don't really fear fire. But then he comes to find out that she had actually burnt her hand when she was a child, very young. She grabbed a skewer that was hot, and it burnt her hand. And this was enough, in Rudy's perspective, to give her that opposition to fire, because she had that pain in her environment when she was younger, and so she's not apt to fire because of that. Additionally, it talks about like dwarves. Dwarves in their environment, up in the hills, working in these mountainsides and all that kind of stuff, working with fire. They have more of affinity to fire and earth because they're in the earth itself, but they have an opposition to water because they're so far away from oceans and lakes, but they also have to deal with floods, water that comes into these mountains and possibly drowns them. Again, something I don't remember in the anime that I thought was extremely fascinating. Again, it goes in that realm of how this writer just loves to get super detailed with a lot of this stuff. Additionally, I like how different the explanation to how he teaches Sylphie incantationless spells. How it's brought up is that she's asking him how he pulls off the spells that he does. When they first met, he used heat to heat up water that poured on her. And she's like, well, how do you do that? Well, you would have to cast heat and you would have to cast water. Well, how do you do that with they're two different incantations? You can't say these two incantations at the same time. Well, he realized at that point, oh, that's because I have to use incantationless spells. I have to combine them, essentially. And I really liked how that was the way that opened the door to her eventually trying it, and yeah, does very well at it. And yes, this leads into them getting in the rain, which he says, like, can't you just stop the rain? He's like, no, that'll mess with the crops. They get home. Of course, he doesn't know that it's a girl, so he immediately decides to disclose her as a joke and finds out, oh, that's actually a girl. It's actually a she. And it's really cool because we do get, yes, similarly to the anime, you get that mindset of Paul at that particular moment, not necessarily Rudy. And Paul's really trying to figure out how differently to take the situation than he did previously. He obviously acknowledges Rudy's my blood. He's obviously going to have a fondness to women. But there's a stark difference here that's happening. He realizes Rudy's treating this differently. He's allowing him to actually explain, but Rudy's treating it differently. He knows that he did wrong. But he obviously knows that Rudy does really care for Sylphie. He spent so much time with her, offered the book that he treasures so much. All this information that tells him he does want to make this right. And so he's like, obviously, just apologize to her. And he goes down there and says, yeah, I didn't know you were a boy because of your hair. And Paul's like, yep, he's an idiot. He's a genius, but he's also an idiot. And getting into chapter 8 later on, the one thing that really stood out to me was how much emphasis this writer at this point is giving into healing spells. Again, this is something that I don't really feel has been dove into too much with the anime itself. He, of course, talks about how they are divided into ranks, just like everything else. But he does note that even with divine magic, can't bring something back to life, or at least he mentions specifically creatures, which obviously anybody that has watched later into the first season, you'll know that's kind of a big question mark that creates, but we'll get to there whenever I get to that point. But an interesting thing that it's getting into here is he's specified that he is healing intermediate and detox beginner. And he's talking about specifically that he feels like he would do better getting into incantationless, but he doesn't have knowledge of how wounds close. Again, we mentioned before, the reason why he's able to do incantationless so well, he's acknowledging the reason why is because he knows the science behind it. He knows how it works scientifically, so he's able to reproduce it rather than have to say a whole incantation. Whereas healing, he's not a doctor. He doesn't know much knowledge in the medical field, so he's not able to use his past knowledge to make it to where he can do incantationless. He has to use incantations. He also jokes about the fact that maybe if he was more into sports in his previous life, that might work here. So he's acknowledging that he has usefulness that's given to him from his previous life, and all the knowledge he's gained from, video games and browsing the internet has actually come to benefit him in some way. And this is, of course, when we get to the point where Rudy is trying to recuperate his relationship with Sylphie. And I found it very interesting with the conversation with Paul. He specifically was going to use the knowledge of Paul grabbing Lilia against him. And I don't think that, I think I went back and checked it, and I didn't see any of that mentioned. So at this point, Rudy knows something happened between the two of them. But also, interestingly enough, Sylphie didn't come to see him. He had to go to the tree and wait for her there when she does actually show up. And he gets really deep into his head about how he can possibly use all this knowledge that he has in dating sims against her to swoon her over, but again, putting very heavy emphasis on the fact that he doesn't necessarily want that type of relationship with Sylphie. He wants a bond with her, a friendship. Yeah, he figures later down the road, when she's older, that might be fine, but he's drawing a line here, which I think is very interesting because, again, with how much bad rep Rudy gets in a lot of other situations, this is one case where you can say he's being decent here, which is kind of shocking. He does know some bounds, I guess. And that's when we get into the family meeting. This was super interesting from an anime-only fan. This whole chapter was like a nugget of information here. Yes, the problem is that Zenith's pregnant, and also Lilia's pregnant, and that's a big, huge issue that everybody knows what happened, that Paul was involved with both of them, and this creates a huge conundrum. And it's funny, yes, Rudy at that point wants to save Lilia. Lilia has done so much for him in his time here, which is definitely very interesting. This is a vantage point of somebody that doesn't really want to get involved with everybody. He has a previous life, and he's very selfish in a lot of ways, but even here, he doesn't want Lilia to leave. He does appreciate Lilia for everything she's done for him. And yes, also, because Lilia does know the secret of the pantsu of Roxy that is in his possession. It was funny in the novel, they actually have a whole conversation. In the anime, it was just a brief shot of her holding them up and him being panicky. But no, they actually get into this whole conversation between. She's like, "What are these?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, they're Roxy's." And she's like, "Why do they smell?" I'm like, "Oh gosh, you should probably wash them." And he's like, "No, please don't do that." And she just puts him back away and leaves. And he thought that entire night that he was gonna get called to a family meeting and he was getting in trouble. No, she kept it a secret. But the crazy thing, and this is a huge one. This is like a very huge missed opportunity, I think, from the anime. I don't usually get mad about things being removed, but this was huge. This scene was huge. Yes, we get the whole interaction. Rudy goes up there and does his big pouty thing to Zenith, saying, "Why is everybody upset? Isn't it Paul's fault? Paul used his power against her, obviously." And that shifts the narrative away, and Zenith officially accepts it. Granted, it does give a little perspective here that Zenith is torn by this too. Zenith loves Lilia. It heavily hits that. Zenith loves Lilia. Lilia did so much for her. They have a bond. They're like sisters. And so at this point right here, this was the nudge that she needed. And she's like, okay, well, accept, that's fine. You'll stay here. We'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. She's still mad at Paul. But the interesting thing is the scene that was missing in the anime. And that is when Zenith leaves, she's obviously mad. She's furious. And Rudy at this point realizes, I'm going to lose my family. And he's like, this could break them up. What's going to happen to my future? If they break up, this is not a good thing. He follows Zenith to her room, knocks on it. She pokes her head out, and he says, I'm sorry, Mom. Don't be mad at Paul. I lied about that. And she says, wait for it. I know. Zenith knows. Zenith knew he was lying, but she also says that she knew this moment would come eventually. So she knows that the whole lie there, that the whole idea of him forcing himself on her, but he knew that he had a weakness for women. She knew that eventually one of these days would come, which it gets into more detail in the extra chapter at the end of this volume, which I'll get into eventually, but it was so good to know Zenith's not an idiot. She wasn't manipulated by Rudy. She even mentions the idea that he was known for this back in the day, and it's to the point where she's like, you probably have older sisters and brothers somewhere out there in the world. But like I said, I think the big key thing there in that scene was that acknowledgement that, you know that you were lying, but she still went through with it. And again, that extra chapter, which we'll get into later, gets into more detail with that, and I thought it was super fascinating. We at this point shift to Lilia's perspective, which again, a lot of this was covered in the anime, but yes, it's getting into more detail here, and this idea that yes, she used to be in the same training facility that Paul once was at. And yes, that one night he actually forced himself upon her. It even notes the idea that she kind of was okay with it, but she didn't like him. And that she even cried at the very beginning of it. It does technically, I mean, yes, in the anime, it does mention that he forced himself on her and flowered her, but it really does skim over it. This does acknowledge the idea that he forced himself upon her, and it was kind of a thing that she didn't like at first, then later on accepted that she kind of liked him based on the different experiences she had. She even mentioned this idea that later on she would end up having this minister that forced himself upon her, and she kind of realized just how much more better it was with Paul, which is kind of unfortunate to kind of think that way, but again, this is times. But yeah, getting further into detail with how this whole thing worked out, that because Paul was no longer able to get with Zenith because she was then pregnant, she sees that opportunity. Like, he's groped me a couple times, I'm gonna allow it. But then this was a moment where she's like, I kind of keep hearing them go at it, and now I have a chance to really quench that thirst. And she welcomed him in with open arms. And she even thought that because she was pregnant, that it was a punishment. Like, she was willing to accept being kicked out. That's why she was so willing to say, I'm sorry, I'll leave as soon as your birth happens, I'll get out of here. Because she was accepting it as a punishment for her sins, for betraying Zenith and everything. But again, because Rudy forgave her, she will forever be in his debt. And when she has that child, yes, she'll make sure that child serves Rudy. Following this whole incident, obviously there's a little bit of a stir with the relationship with everybody. It was interesting that at this point, we do have this moment where Rudy kind of, in seeing how Paul screwed this whole situation up, it sort of gives him a thought process that I don't really want to have a harem. It's kind of like, yes, we have this previous life Rudy who is this perv and he's into all these harem games and these dating sims, and obviously would love to have a harem in this new world. There's a point where he kind of realizes, I don't really want what Paul's doing. Like, I don't know that I want to have a harem. Specifically, the thing that he notes is he never wants to see a face that Zenith had at that moment. The same face that Zenith gave him in realizing all this that was happening. He never wants to see his wife or his girlfriend have that same face. It's very interesting to note. And yes, gets into the final segment of chapter 9 that we'll get through, which is, yes, the birth of Norn and Aisha. That's something that was completely skipped over in the anime, which I thought was really fascinating, honestly. And this gives us a lot, again, more perspective into the bond that Zenith and Rudy will eventually talk about in the later parts of the first volume. It's kind of one of those things that I keep seeing so much in this first volume that kind of gives so much more insight into Zenith as a character. But again, that's for later. But yes, because Lilia is obviously far into her pregnancy as well, they get a midwife to help with the actual birth. The unfortunate thing is that midwife isn't very knowledgeable about breaches, and yes, we're dealing with a breech birth here. What's interesting is that Lilia is able to walk them through the whole process and help them out. But additionally, Rudy is there the whole time, offering hot water, and additionally healing Zenith the entire pregnancy. He's using his spells to help her because obviously this is a very stressful and painful situation. Thankfully, Norn comes out safely. Everything's fine there, but unfortunately, after this whole incident, Lilia goes into labor. So, being exhausted after all that, now Lilia has to deliver her child prematurely, obviously, because again, this is a pregnancy that came out after we found out the pregnancy of Zenith. This is something, thankfully, that the midwife is very familiar with, so she's able to help with this whole situation. But yeah, it's a very stressful situation. It was very stressful to read it, even though I know the outcome. But again, this was really cool to give a perspective that Rudy was there helping the entire time. And it gets even more into that afterwards with technically, now they're all flustered, but Lily is the only one accepting of everything that's going on because they had it easy with Rudy. They don't have it easy with these two. But yeah, that is chapter 7 through 9. So I guess I'll have probably, I don't know. There's a whole segment on Labyrinths that I think I'm going to geek out on, but hopefully we'll only have one more segment to go through for the first volume before we can move on to the next volume. But hope you guys enjoyed this video as always. Like I said before, technically the first part didn't perform extremely well. So if you guys have any groups of people that are reading through it, definitely share out the video. Definitely helps us out. Any clicks you can get helps us out. Additionally, if you want to support us more, we have a Patreon link and a tips link in the description below. Definitely appreciate everybody that's checked out this video. I love you guys' support, and this has been a fun passion project for me. So look forward to the next part. Y'all take care.